Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dariusz Jemielniak to you on the one hand, and Yaroslav Krempovych on the other hand. I'm very sorry for my very bad pronunciation. You will certainly correct this in a minute. Both of them are Polish by background. Both of them work at Kozminski University in Warsaw. And we haven't met before. The reason why we are talking to each other today is an excellent and very interesting paper that I will very briefly present in a minute. But before doing that, let me very briefly present our speakers. So Professor Jemielniak is full professor of organization studies and management at Kozminski University. And he's also the chair of something which is called MINDS, which stands for Management in Networked and Digital Societies, and it's a department at the university. He is also, that's also very interesting to mention, one of the fellows of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. That's an institution in Harvard. And you might remember that Lawrence Lessig, who is one of the fellow speakers here in this podcast, was quite closely related to that center. And is still closely related to the center. And Dariusz is also, in addition to this, a visiting scholar at MIT, so the other big institution over there in Boston, a visiting scholar at MIT Center for Collective Intelligence. And he is also part of the board of trustees of Wikimedia. He is very active in academia, but also in business and in economics. He's one of the founding partners of quite some influential and important startups in Poland. Yaroslav is one of the PhD students of Dariusz. So we see a very successful collaboration here between a professor and one of his students, because the paper that we are talking about here did indeed have some impact in the academic debate, but also on Twitter in particular and in other areas of social media. And the paper has the title AstraZeneca Vaccine Disinformation on Twitter. And that's not only the title, but it's also the subject. So we are talking about a specific analysis on in how far there is and there was disinformation on Twitter when it comes to AstraZeneca, one of the vaccines, and whether or not that has an impact and how it and where and from where it comes. Some of you might see that AstraZeneca, one of the vaccines that were quite early available in Europe, has decreased significantly in its importance on a daily basis. Many people no longer receive this vaccination. And one of the reasons why this might have happened is that there was so much rumor about this specific vaccine. All three of us obviously are not virologists. We are not experts in vaccines. We don't know anything about the medical debate behind the different assessments of the different vaccines and whether there are any differences. So this is not what we are talking about today. We are explicitly talking about how rumors on vaccines emerge and whether or not there is that has an impact on the policy and also on the regulatory level. Dariusz, Yaroslav, thank you so much for coming. Let us perhaps briefly start by letting us know how this paper was written, how you start, what the basic idea at the beginning was, whether there's any further development since you published this paper, which was posted in April 2021. So approximately 6 months ago, quite some time since then. Let us know what this is about from your perspective, please.
I can take the first take on that, and Yaroslav, I'm sure, will add. First of all, the paper we published as a preprint, but just recently got published in Public Health Journal, which is a great thing. It is a very well-fitting journal, and basically the idea that we had was that we saw that there was a huge debate in the media about AstraZeneca. As you probably remember, there was this issue of blood clots allegedly related to this vaccine. As you mentioned, we are not medical experts, so we cannot possibly comment on that. But what we can comment on is the public discourse. And in the public discourse, there was quite a lot of negative information about AstraZeneca. So we were very interested in this situation. What is happening when there's so much anticipation, so much discussion about the incoming vaccines, everybody's waiting for them. And then there's a bomb, something may be wrong with one of them. So we wanted to analyze how are people reacting on Twitter to this particular phenomena, and in particular, what kind of media are being used, whether people who are posting about AstraZeneca are related or not. This was definitely of huge interest to me personally. That's why I asked my brilliant PhD student and also an accomplished venture capitalist, Yaroslav Krempovych, Ukrainian by nationality, who helped me to gather data, analyze it, and that's how it went.
Mm-hmm. And how exactly did you do it? Did you simply start a bot collecting tweets on Twitter, or what exactly did you do?
Yaroslav, you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used some of the methods, some of the available libraries to retrospectively collect historical data as well as continuously scraping new data. One of the key differences is that historical data is in a way much more cleared by the Twitter algorithms itself. So a lot of misinformation at some point of the time is already caught. However, the part of the information that we have been able to identify was not identified by the Twitter misinformation algorithm, and therefore stayed in our dataset for a longer time. So we retrospectively collected the data.
Okay, so just to understand this correctly, although Twitter runs its own algorithms to identify misinformation and to delete misinformation on the platform, you were still able to collect more than 50,000 tweets retrospectively with AstraZeneca in its subject, of which you assume that they are misinforming.
Well, not all of them are misinforming.
But some of them, at least, a given amount, and an unclear amount of them are misinforming.
Correct.
Okay, and those 51,000 tweets that you collected, all of them had a hashtag, which is AstraZeneca. That was the selection criterion, right? Okay, and you would call this a big data analysis in a way, right? So perhaps give us a little bit of additional understanding of what the purpose of collecting such amounts of data is, and what you then did with this data.
Yeah, so I can take that. It's not really such a big data set. I mean, we're dealing with data sets which have tens of millions of tweets in our other projects. But here, it was a very simple thing. There were no more tweets. We collected all of them. That's how it went. And it is sort of big data in a way that we were using tools that are typical for big data analysis. So even for a relatively small data set, given that it contained all hashtag AstraZeneca that remained on Twitter, it is definitely an analysis worth doing. And what we did was basically we used Python, as you know, as our basic language to analyze occurrences of links to media. So we were studying what kind of media is mentioned in those tweets. For example, we were curious, are people who are publishing about AstraZeneca linking to The Guardian, or are they linking to Russia Today? This was definitely something we wanted to find out. And we also analyzed the media before the information about the alleged blood clots occurred, and the information after. And above of all that, Yaroslav was also able to do the social network analysis, which means that he was trying to analyze whether there is some coercion between the accounts that are seemingly unrelated, but sometimes when you look at the data set, you can see that they look as if they were coordinating their actions.
And the period of time of which you analyzed the tweets was relatively short. It was somewhere in early spring 2021. Are you still analyzing tweets since then?
Even today, yeah. Yaroslav can tell more about it. But even today, we're working on a paper that covers all vaccines, and we on a longer period of time. So we definitely want to go deeper and longer. Compare, for example, is misinformation typical just to AstraZeneca, or maybe this is something that is typical of other vaccines too, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and could you give an answer to that question already? So is it typical for AstraZeneca, or is it true for all the vaccines? Or you don't know yet?
Yaroslav,
or you don't want to tell yet? I don't know.
Yaroslav is reluctant to give an answer because as a proper scientist, he doesn't want to jump to conclusions before our research is done. But I can tell you, but I can tell you, I'm a full professor, so I can I can also speak ex cathedra, and from my intuition is my intuition is that discourse about vaccines is really, really full of a lot of misinformation. This is what we're observing in many different topics. We have a large project studying anti-vaccination sentiments. And this is a topic that is super full of misinforming and disinforming tweets. So I would be very surprised if other vaccines were not really full of it too.
Yeah. Okay. But then let's come back to the paper, because this is already something which is out there in the public, so it's reliable and we can discuss it. So the main outcome of this, in my words, is that there is plenty of misinformation on Twitter. Plenty of this misinformation is coming from bots, and plenty of the misinformation can be or is related to some media sources coming from nations or areas possibly having an interest in the matter. Let's put it like this. Would you agree? And would you go a little bit more into detail if you agree?
Yaroslav, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, so to start from the end, concerning the regions, definitely that there was some significant influx of coordinated activity from the perspective of Pakistan-Indian relations. Looking at the, I'm sorry, Bangladesh. Apologies for that. Looking at the data, we found that there was a large amount of coordinated activity that seemingly at the first glance, the accounts were not coordinated. However, the text that they used, the hashtag they used, the combination of the word they used, according to our analysis of similarity, showed that the messages were more or less the same to a large extent. To the threshold that we have applied, which was again very high. So we can categorize them as the same. So they coordinated the same message to amplify its visibility on Twitter, which was mostly concerned with the donation of the vaccines from India and specifically Serum Institute to the Bangladesh in order to support the vaccination activities in the Bangladesh. So it was in a way a promotion activity. However, taking into account the research into the vaccine diplomacy and discussion covered in the media, it looked very much as an attempt to amplify the political influence over the Bangladeshi state from India.
But you also have another conclusion, because of course Bangladesh and India are important, but they are not that important for the European market, whereas there is another statement in your conclusions which is very important to the European market, and I may quote now from your conclusions, where you write, I quote, "Popular disinformation tweets are spread not only by individual powerful activists and conspiracy websites, but also by state-owned media supported by networks of disinformation farms. Given the fact that Russia has a heavy interest in promoting its own Sputnik V vaccine, both for economic and political reasons, the activity of Russia today in posting often negative information about AstraZeneca may be perceived as part of a larger campaign potentially aimed at discrediting the vaccine." End of quote. So this is, of course, very interesting for Europeans, because this is this is what happened then in April and since then, right? That the AstraZeneca vaccine got more and more, at least in my perspective, discredited and left more and more the market. At the moment, at least in Austria, there are more or less no people any longer being vaccinated with AstraZeneca. So my question here is now, how did you find that out again? So again, a little bit of question about the methodology behind it. And then also whether you think that there is additional information available that might also lead into this direction. And then finally, whether you think that there should be some political/legal debate about this outcome.
Yeah, just to clarify, we didn't catch anybody red-handed. You know, there was no smoking gun, but let me tell you, there was a lot of smoke. So quite clearly, we are not claiming Russia today was definitely misinforming. What we're saying is that, seen altogether, the fact that they were publishing predominantly negative information about AstraZeneca could be perceived as a campaign, because misinformation is not just one article. Misinformation is oftentimes the proportions between positive, negative information as related to the reality. If the reality is, for example, that somebody died after AstraZeneca shot, statistically, it's not surprising. People die all the time, right? But if you will write articles every single day, somebody died after AstraZeneca, after AstraZeneca, it will create an image in the mind of the reader that these two are related, and it will disproportionately basically distort the reality. So I would say it's definitely against the typical information mission of any news agency. So your question is basically related to a very complex issue, because AstraZeneca, as you probably recall, also was at odds with the European Union, European Commission about deliveries. There was a lot of brouhaha, contracts, suing, going to court. So I would say that the backlash is probably not just related to misinformation. It's also related to the business relations with this company. And obviously, I wouldn't be surprised if these two were quite very much conflated in a way that, AstraZeneca, if they were playing fair and square, hand in hand with the European Commission, as the European Commission perceived their contract, rather than at odds with them, I think they would probably be still in the market to some extent. But what I find super interesting, and it's super important for many other topics, is that from the market perspective, AstraZeneca is clearly on a very similar shelf as Sputnik vaccine. We know that technology is very similar. We even know there are allegations that the technology itself for Sputnik has been appropriated from AstraZeneca. It is a similar price range. It is a similar technology. So from this point of view, Sputnik and AstraZeneca are business-wise in a very direct competition. If a medium, a state-sponsored medium, a medium that is often accused of being basically a tool of state propaganda, and I'm not commenting on that, and we're quoting research that shows that it is so. If this medium publishes a lot of really negative information about AstraZeneca and very little positive information about AstraZeneca, one has to ask a question: is there somebody who made the decision, or is it random? If it's random, we can speak of bad journalism, but really, really bad journalism. If it's not random, well, then you have misinformation campaign.
Yeah, but the interesting part for me, Dariusz, if I may add to this, is not so much that there are media that are disinforming, that is well known, right? And there's plenty of media information out there which is disinforming. The interesting part is that this is then used on another platform, which is now Twitter in this case, by seemingly neutral third parties trying to share this media content that is disinforming, and to build up another category of disinformation, which is, of course, much more powerful than the first one, because if you have this in your Twitter timeline 3 times a day from different people whom you trust, it's a completely different story from just one media article somewhere. So this is, in my view, the important part, for me, at least as a lawyer here, the important part, because it triggers the question how we need to deal with platforms and platform moderation and fake news on or disinformation on platforms. Do you have any comment on this?
I have a quick comment. Maybe Yaroslav will help me here as well. But one thing to really keep in mind here is that if this is so, and very clearly the phenomenon of social networks really being the distribution channel is happening, it's a fact. If it is so, then analyzing just the news in any news outlet is not enough anymore. Because we can imagine a news outlet that is publishing a very balanced point of view, but is spending a lot of resources to promote on the social media on the one side. If you do not look at the social media, you will not even be able to observe that this particular outlet is not objective, is very skewed towards one line. And I think this is the future. This is what is going to happen, because very often there is a hidden agenda, but you want to present yourself as objective. You want to present yourself as weighing all, as proportionally reflecting the reality. So the best way to do it would be to, publish articles about everything, but, put quite a lot of tools and effort and resources behind promoting the view they want to have promoted.
Absolutely. And this is also very haunting in a way, because it's so I would assume that it's so time consuming and complex to identify these tendencies then on the platforms. So Yaroslav, perhaps give us some insight, if I may ask you to, how much work is it to do such an analysis? How much time did it take you? How long? So is it reasonable to believe that one could do this for every single problem that might be politically relevant?
I believe it's possible to algorithmically compute the method to do it proactively, and I believe that platforms have many of those methods already applied. And actually, adding a bit on the previous question, on terms of what platforms can do and what we need to observe and to police this phenomenon better. I believe that the coverage in the non-crucial regions for the platform, I mean the Middle East, Eastern Europe, other languages, LATAM, is crucial for better policing, especially in other languages, as we've seen in some of the latest media reports that the Facebook and Twitter are not very good at detecting the misinformation, especially in other languages. Coming back to the question, yes, I believe it's absolutely feasible to do this proactively. The majority of the time that is really needed is to detect the necessary hit points or hashtags and to collect the data. And very often those data are somehow not representative, small, and so on. So we were very lucky of AstraZeneca being a very large data set, as in general. Also, there is a lot of stream of data. However, oftentimes the majority of the time is spent on actually understanding the discourse and identifying the points that can be extracted.
Yeah, you also mentioned one of the limitations, however, of this analysis, which is the language issue, right? So also you in your paper, you needed to focus on those tweets which are in English. So the majority of the tweets dealing with AstraZeneca in this period of time were not in English. So nobody knows what was behind them, right? So that makes it perhaps even, at least for, if I get you correctly, you say that the platforms would manage to master to identify this misinformation on their platform, but there is a language issue. And I would say now, from the outside perspective, there's not only the language issue, but there's also the computing power issue or manpower issue, because not too many people have so much free time to invest their time in chasing what's happening on a social platform. So what is the role of the public then, or the academic public, in order to monitor what's happening there? Or do we need to leave all this to the platforms themselves?
Before I give the floor to you, Yaroslav, I want to quickly comment on that, because it's a complex issue. First of all, language is not so important in many analyses. If you analyze coordination, we don't care all that much about the content.
That's
we only care about which accounts are basically colluding. But there's one important caveat of our research. Our research was by design retroactive. And it took us weeks and weeks to analyze something that was happening. So the damage was already done. It's very easy to analyze misinformation of a certain topic after a while. But if you consider the big picture is the damage is happening this minute, this hour. People are reading it and they go on. They do not come back to tweets from weeks back. So from this point of view, sure, the research community and the European Union actually is spending quite a lot of money on research in this area. The research community is able to do research, but is not really able to develop viable counter action methods that would be in real time. And I think the social networks are super capable and could be doing this, but you have to consider this is against their business model. What they actually live on is information that is causing people to react, that is engaging people. Very often this will be something that is contrary to their beliefs or contrary to the common knowledge. And by definition, it's misinformation, disinformation is more engaging than regular, same old, mundane facts. But sorry, Yaroslav, I cut you off there.
I absolutely shared your opinion, Theodor. So nothing to add here from my side.
Okay. But then, Dariusz, I mean, the question that pops up from my legal perspective on this is then how to deal with this. So what should the European Union do then? And do you have any recommendations coming out of your outcomes on what we need to do from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, so
and I have a second question then, which is, did you receive any feedback leading into a regulatory debate coming out of the paper?
So the actual feedback that we received was mostly from the media, and one feedback from a website which we described as spreading misinformation was very vocally objecting to that, which is quite funny because, you know, this was a website that had the most bizarre pieces of misinformation, you know, and pretty
and that's not really relevant because this is not the important part of the paper, right? It's not really relevant. Yeah.
Definitely. But regarding my personal opinion on regulation, and as a non-lawyer, you know, I might be very, very badly positioned here to give advice, but I think we need to think about the cause and effect. If you see damage, the damage is done by the social networks. It's undisputable. It's already proven in hundreds of papers. If we see the damage, why there's no responsibility for the damage? The legal shields that are used currently, I think, are based on anachronistic approach, anachronistic view of what the social networks are. They're not the traditional media. They're something new, and this something new has to be defined by law, but also from the perspective of the damage it's doing. If there is damage, there should be responsibility. The responsibility for stopping the spread of misinformation. And I don't care if they're doing something. I only care if they do enough. And they're not doing enough, even though they have enormous resources. My best guess is that the social networks like Facebook and YouTube, Twitter, could stop misinformation if they really want it, but it's not really the top priority. It's maybe priority number 5. Priority number 1 is engagement, views, clicks. As long as we as the society, the law, do not expect anything better, we shouldn't blame them. They are playing the game as it's designed. So we need to design the game in such a way that are responsible.
But Dariusz, I mean, one of the interesting parts here, in my view at least, is that a lot of the tweets, I would assume, that had AstraZeneca with a hashtag attached to them were not wrong in the sense of that they were misinforming, right? It's probably, I mean, there were cases with cloths and all this, and probably the impact comes from, you know, you have this 10 times in your timeline and 2 of them are obviously stupid and 3 of them are extreme and 3 of them are somewhere mainstream, and all this builds up an opinion then in a way, right? So what should the platform then do? Simply delete all the extreme one and leave the others? Or and obviously this has a strong, very, very strong fundamental rights implication, which is freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, freedom of information, data protection, plenty of other fundamental rights coming with this. So what exactly, how should they navigate through this? Is this reasonable?
Yeah, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit already, which is much less extreme than trying to cherry pick the nuanced views which are reporting negative sides. I mean, even if allegation that vaccinations are used to spread chips that Bill Gates will be using to control your minds, even if this was weeded out and tweets like this exist, this would already be a good step, but weed it out before it does damage. So not one day, 1 week after, but as it's happening. There should be a task force, algorithmic AI, plus a team of people who are combating this. And what the social networks are doing now is pretty much it, but with too little resources. They should be scale it up a couple of orders of magnitude. So when it comes to the problem as you defined, that we need to also spread not just disinformation, but also misinformation. Yeah, sure, we should, but there's so many steps that we need to take that we know what already are and they are not done. I would park this conversation about, you know, the problem of proportions and misinforming us for a later debate, because as you just said, there's quite a number of considerations about a free speech, about who's actually responsible, and so on and so forth. If somebody's a newspaper, if there's a newspaper agency with professional journalists hired, is this really the responsibility of the social network to make sure that it proportionally bumps up tweets that are representing a proportional view, I think it would be very difficult to arrange. But there's quite a number of things they can do. The most popular tweet that is still out there that we found was absolutely conspiracy theory, very clear, very black and white picture. So even if we start with that, it will already be an improvement.
And did you receive any reactions from any platform on the paper after it was published? No.
No, not really. Well, again, I mean, platforms see papers like this come out every month, and what they do is basically try to wait it out. So I think unless there's some regulatory move, and I do not blame the platforms, I blame the regulators. Unless there's some very strong regulatory approach, I don't think it'll change.
It's astonishing because, I mean, some of the tweets about your paper were very, very popular in April and May. Some of them received several thousand retweets. So the topic was very much on the agenda, at least on Twitter, I would say. Which brings me to the question whether you are doing similar research with other social networks, or is Twitter the only one that you're interested in?
Yaroslav, why don't you take that?
So, general Twitter is the most accessible, taking into account the structure.
Which is also an interesting point already, because there might be an incentive of platforms of not being accessible, right? So,
I believe
stop making people talk about you.
That comes a bit from design of it, right? Yeah. So then the micro messaging limited by the number of signs, it definitely brings availability of a lot of different opinions, even though structured threads. It's very easy to share your thoughts. It's very, very easy to share the information. Therefore, as a data sort, it looks to be a very consistent and very easy to work with. That's why general Twitter is the easiest way to go. We are exploring some of the direction with other networks, especially the closed messaging ones like Telegram. However, and definitely Facebook. However, the availability of methods of accessibility of the information down there is so there is basically a very few methods to access it, which is obviously also a very big problem in the research of the misinformation online. Facebook at some point severely limited accessibility for research purposes because of well-known scandals, starting with Cambridge Analytica and so on. However, it affected the quality of research and availability of insight from academic standpoint to a very large amount.
Yeah, and that brings me to one of my last questions, if I may, whether both of you could comment on how difficult it is to access the necessary information for research like the one that you are undertaking, both from a technical and a regulatory point of view, because also from a regulatory point of view, it's quite some burdensome to get access to these data if you really want to follow the rules coming from the platforms. So would you see any need for change here?
Maybe I'll start with the regulatory part, and Yaroslav can comment on the technical one. I think it is outrageous that there are no modalities for researchers to do research. This is the element of public control, and the social networks are getting rid of the oversight of public control by saying, "Oh, we are we're protecting your private data." No, you're not. They're not protecting the public in any way. They are cutting off some marketing companies by promoting their own services, by the way, but they are cutting off researchers, and this is bad, because if we do not have public oversight, they can do whatever they want. So I would say that the social networks should start with making special privileged access for researchers, allowing to basically to see what is happening. Without this, even the regulators will not be able to accurately see what is happening. Yeah. Technically, Yaroslav can comment on that. It's an uphill battle. The access is changing all the time. The modalities. Even today, we were discussing how to get some sorts of data and it's getting increasingly difficult.
But let's stick briefly, if I may, with the regulatory part. So is this a call for a legal obligation now to open access to social media data for independent research?
Absolutely.
Period. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Period. Of course, with some caveats, because we need to make sure that it's not a door, it's not a gateway for marketing scams. It's not a gateway for poor research. So there should be some oversight, probably academic boards, committees that would approve such access. But nevertheless, if something is public discourse, much more than newspapers, it has to be regulated. How do we even know what is happening there if nobody's actually looking at their hands?
And isn't it astonishing that this hasn't happened really in the last 15 years or so, because it's in Europe at least?
Yeah. But to be perfectly honest, look at the cookies regulation. When it was introduced, it was already way too late and so lame that it is just a nuisance right now. So I do not have high expectations here.
Yeah. So then perhaps Yaroslav, you have higher expectations when it comes to the technical solutions or the technical developments, or would you also be as frustrated as Dariusz is on this perspective?
I think I'm the main source of frustration from our duo in research. So this is very much uphill battle. So there are several open source methods to work with Twitter developed by OSINT community, what is very interesting. So open source intelligence communities that also do that part of the independent research online. However, the algorithms, the APIs, the endpoints on Twitter are constantly changing, but they are trying to limit the availability of data, especially retrospectively, even though they platforms that they do offer some kind of added functionality and added data access. However, very often the amount of the data that are needed for a larger research employing big data methods, those are not available in non-commercial plans, right? So the cost of acquiring the data from the platforms is also very high, and the platforms included it in their business model. So basically, the fees for academia are also very high.
And just to add that once again, there are platforms which are not really interested in having an independent academic oversight and are much more restrictive than Twitter might be in their business model and also in not allowing then academics to get access. So Twitter is probably, as you said, the one that is the most transparent here. If you compare it with Telegram or Parler or whatever out there, it's getting much more, or WhatsApp, it's getting much more difficult than probably, right? So, yeah. So thank you so much, Dariusz and Yaroslav. It's mind-blowing and it's haunting, but at the same time, it's also really, really interesting to listen to you and to this. Also, and in particular from a regulatory point of view. Thank you for sharing this with us. And I would really appreciate to hear more about the follow-up studies that you are making at the moment. All the best to the two of you. Thank you for coming, and thank you to our audience for listening to this. Please stay in touch with us, stay interested, and in particular, stay or become as quickly as healthy as possible. All the best to all of you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.